Hi folks, today we're going to be talking about the need to collect, analyze, and interpret data in our own lives. And we're also going to see why it's useful in other areas as well. So we're going to begin with interpreting data. So take a look at this scenario with the surgeon and the patient. So we had the social psychologist, Allison Ledgerwood. She took two groups and they provided information about a surgical procedure and asked for their thoughts on the procedure. So what happened in group one, uh, she ended up phrasing that this procedure had a 70% success rate. And in group two, they were told for that same procedure, it had a 30% failure rate. So as soon as you hear 70% success rate, that does mean 30% failure. So the way they're actually displaying this data to the patients, they wanted to see if it had an effect. Well, so here's what happened initially. So in the group one study, where they told a 70% success rate, people heard that and they said, a majority actually said, oh yeah, this procedure sounded good. Now group two, they said the 30% failure rate. With a 30% failure rate, the majority of the people in that group actually adamantly disapproved of this procedure. So you might say, okay, that's great, but different groups, different people. So actually, let's look and see what happens. They did an interesting component to this study, a little twist, and it was then tell them the opposite information. So in group one, they were told that the 70% success rate also had a 30% failure rate. As soon as those people were told that, they went from a majority thinking, okay, this is great, we like this procedure, to a majority disapproving of the procedure. Okay, in a similar manner, you might say, okay, so maybe group two did this flip flop. So they were told the 30% failure rate initially, and then they said, okay, well, that also means that we have a 70% success rate. So they went from a disapproval, in that case, of the procedure to remaining a disapproval. So what this shows is being able to, one, interpret the results once the data is displayed, and then being able to display it in a meaningful way to people. How do you actually convey this message of your data to others is going to be extremely important. Okay, so now along with that, obviously we have collecting and analyzing some data. So let's go to this surgery checklist. So let me explain what I mean by this. So in 2008, we had a team of doctors created this checklist for operating rooms at hospitals in order to decrease the number of complications with surgery, or at least that's what they thought would happen. Okay, or at least try. So now the team chose 8 hospitals from a wide variety of backgrounds. So just to give you an idea, there were rural and urban hospitals, and some were public, some were charity, some were more district hospitals. Uh, they had anywhere ranging from around 370 hospital beds up to 1,800 hospital beds in these hospitals. And then from an assortment of countries. So we had a hospital from Jordan, a hospital from India, a hospital from the U.S., a hospital from England, Canada, the Philippines, Tanzania, and New Zealand. So they were trying to find a sample that they could use where from a wide variety of those backgrounds. And they wanted to see if the checklist, if just implementing this checklist showed any improvements for the number of surgical complications. So let's take a look a little bit further. What was the checklist? So now there's 3 components. One was before anesthesia, and so what they had before anesthesia, the patient confirmed their identity, the site of the procedure itself, and then consent. And then they would also mark the site of where the procedure was happening. And then anesthesia safety check would be completed. They'd make sure all the equipment checking pulse and things like that was functioning properly. And then is there a known allergy for the patient? Is there a difficult airway on the patient? And then if there is a risk of blood loss, should we have those fluids and whatnot planned ahead of time? Okay, so you might say, okay, that's no-brainers for surgery. So now what happens once the blade hits the skin? Okay, so for right before the skin incision, they had all the team members actually give themselves by name and role, and sometimes there'd be new teams together. So this is actually quite important. The surgeon would an anesthesia professional and nurse verbally confirm the patient, the site, and the procedure once again. And then the surgeon, anesthesiologist, and then nursing team would review these critical events, and then they talk about antibiotics and is the essential imaging being displayed already. Okay, and then after the surgery, so before the patient leaves the operating room, the nurse will verbally confirm the name of the procedure recorded, the instruments used like sponge and needles and all those counts are correct, how the specimen is labeled, including the patient name, and then whether there are any equipment problems to be addressed, and then the surgeon, anesthesiologist, and nurse review the key concerns for recovery and management of the patient. So now you say, okay, these would be things they could do by heart, right, without remembering to do a checklist. So why bother with the checklist? Well, let's check it out. Let's see what the results. So after the study ended, 80% of the staff members reported that the checklist was easy to use. Remember, that means 20% said, oh, not necessarily easy. So, and they also said it did not take a long time to complete, and then it had improved the safety of care. So now the numbers are in. Here's where the fun begins. That little checklist, what happened? Well, 78% actually observed the checklist to have prevented an error in the operating room. So just going through that procedure at those different stages of the surgery, 78% prevented an error. Okay. Now, from that group of nearly 4,000 patients, if you take what they observed prior to implementing the checklist, that observation data would have said, okay, there should be 435 people having serious complications. However, after the checklist was implemented, only 277 such complications occurred. So now, here's the question, right? In terms of we collected, and now we want to analyze. Are these results significant enough to require all hospitals in the world to adopt a checklist for performing operations? Now, obviously, this is a little bit easier because there is no cost associated with a checklist, right? But sometimes businesses and things and people, there's a cost associated with this too. So making decisions based upon the data provided, that's what we have to analyze. So now just to further explain, in fact, of all these 8 hospitals, the major complications fell by 36% after introduction of the checklist. And then on top of that, the number of deaths fell by 47%. So hopefully that hits the point home in terms of being able to analyze some data that's come before you. If you want to check out more about that information of the checklist, there's a book called The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. Very good book, goes into detail some of this in building of the checklist itself. So yeah, check that out and let me know if you have any questions in terms of the importance of the need to collect, analyze, interpret data, also better known as the need for statistics.